In October 1929, the wealthiest country in the world destroyed itself in a matter of days. In the years that followed, 25% of Americans lost their jobs. Thousands of banks collapsed overnight. Farmers watched their land get seized. Families who had spent decades building something watched it disappear in weeks. Soup kitchens stretched out around the city blocks. Children went to school hungry. Grown men stood on street corners selling apples for 5 cents just to survive. The Great Depression was the single worst economic catastrophe in modern history. It lasted a decade, it reshaped governments, rewrote the rules of finance, and scarred an entire generation so deeply that their grandchildren still feel the effects today. But here's what most people don't know: it didn't have to be this bad. The depression wasn't just caused by a stock market crash, it was caused by a series of catastrophic decisions made by people who were supposed to prevent exactly this from happening. This is how it started, this is how it spiraled, and this is what it actually cost. To understand the depression, you have to understand what came before it. The 1920s in America were extraordinary. The economy was booming, manufacturing output doubled, car, radios, and refrigerators were transforming every day. New industries were creating new fortunes seemingly overnight, and the stock market was on fire. Between 1920 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average increased by almost 500%. Everyone wanted in: factory workers, teachers, shop owners, ordinary people who had never owned a stock in their lives were pouring their savings into the market. Banks were lending money aggressively, so people could buy even more stocks. Investors were buying on margin, meaning they'd put down $10 and borrow 90, betting that the market would keep going up forever. At its peak in September 1929, the market was valued at a level that had absolutely no connection to the actual earnings of the companies it represented. It was a bubble, a massive, fragile, overinflated bubble. Everyone could see it was inflated. Almost nobody wanted to be the one to say so out loud, because the money was too good. Then on October 24th, 1929, a day that will become known as Black Thursday, it all came apart. In a single day, 13 million shares were traded, a volume the market had never seen before. Prices collapsed. Investors who had borrowed heavily to buy stocks suddenly owed far more than their portfolios were worth. Margin calls flooded in. Pay back the loans immediately or your positions get liquidated. Forced selling drove prices lower. Lower prices triggered more margin calls. More margin calls triggered more selling. It was a death spiral with no floor. By the end of October, the market had lost 30% of its value. By the time it finally hit bottom, in 1932, it had lost 89%. 89%. A portfolio worth $100,000 in 1929 was worth $11,000 in 1932. An entire generation of savings gone. But the stock market crash alone did not cause the Great Depression. What turned a bad crash into a decade long catastrophe was what happened next. When stock prices collapsed, people panicked, and when people panicked, they go to their banks. Thousands of Americans lined up to withdraw their savings simultaneously. Bank didn't have the cash. They never do. Bank lend out most of the money deposited with them. When everyone demands it back at once, the bank fails. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks in the United States collapsed. 9,000. When a bank failed, the deposits inside it were gone. There were no federal deposit insurance in 1929. If your bank failed, your savings simply ceased to exist. Families who had done nothing wrong, who had never speculated in the stock market, who had been careful and responsible, lost everything because their bank happened to be in the wrong city at the wrong time. With banks collapsing, credit dried up completely. Business couldn't borrow to make payroll. They fired workers. Workers stopped spending. Business lost revenue. More business failed, more workers got fired. And then the government made it worse. The Federal Reserve, which existed specifically to prevent this kind of financial collapse, raised interest rate in the middle of the crisis. Their reasoning was to defend the gold standard and prevent capital from fleeing the country. The effect was to choke off any remaining economic activity at the precise moment the economy needed cheap money the most. Congress simultaneously passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, massive taxes on imported goods designed to protect American industry. Other countries retaliated immediately with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed by 65% in 3 years. Every major policy decision made during the early depression made it worse, not through malice, but through a fundamental misunderstanding of how economies actually work under catastrophic stress. By 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt had seen enough. On his first day in office, he declared a bank holiday, closing every bank in America for 4 days to stop the bleeding. Congress passed emergency banking legislation in 8 hours. When banks reopened, the runs had stopped. Confidence, even fragile confidence, had returned. Roosevelt then launched the New Deal, a sweeping set of programs designed to put people back to work and rebuild the financial systems from the ground up. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, guaranteeing bank deposits so ordinary people would never again lose their savings in a bank failure. It still exists today. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to regulate the stock market and prevent the kind of reckless speculation that caused the crash. It still exists today. Hundreds of thousands of unemployed Americans were put to work building roads, bridges, dams, schools, and national parks through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Work Progress Administration. The New Deal didn't end the depression, but it stopped the free fall, and the institution it created have prevented a repeat of 1929 for nearly a century. The final toll of the Great Depression is almost incomprehensible. Unemployment peaked at 25% in 1933. In some cities, it was closer to 50%. US GDP fell by 30% between 1929 and 1933. Industrial output was cut in half. Hundreds of thousands of families lost their homes and farms. Entire communities, called Hooservilles, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up across American cities. Makeshift camps of people who had nowhere left to go. The Depression spread globally. Germany's economy collapsed under the weight of war reparations and Depression era deflation. The resulting political instability contributed directly to the conditions that brought Adolf Hitler to power. The Great Depression didn't just cause economic suffering, it reshaped the political map of the entire world. What finally ended the Great Depression wasn't the New Deal, it was World War II. When America entered the war in 1941, the government began spending at a scale that dwarfed the New Deal entirely. The factories that had been idle for a decade were retooled for war production overnight. Unemployment effectively disappeared as millions of men joined the military and millions of women entered the workforce to replace them. By 1944, the US unemployment rate was down to 1%. The economic lesson that economists took from this was profound. Government spending at sufficient scale can end even the deepest recession. It was a lesson that directly shaped how governments around the world responded to the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. The shadow of 1929 still falls across every major financial policy decision made today. The Great Depression happened because a speculative bubble collapsed, bank failed, and the people in charge made a series of decisions that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. But the lasting legacy isn't the suffering, it's the systems built in response to it. Every protection that exists in the modern financial system, deposit insurance, market regulation, central bank intervention, government stimulus, exists because of what happened between 1929 and 1939. The next time you hear someone say the government should stay out of the economy entirely, remember that the last time it did, a quarter of the country lost their jobs and 9,000 banks collapsed. The Great Depression didn't just teach us what can go wrong, it taught us exactly that what needs to be in place to prevent it from happening again. Whether those protections are enough for whatever comes next, that's a question worth thinking about. Next week, I'm covering another moment in financial history that changed the world, and the lessons from it are just as relevant today. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and if this one made you think, send it to someone who needs to see it. See you next week.